You're listening to the best, the bravest. Interviews with the FDNY's elite. Our streak of FD shows continues. Welcome back to the Mike the New Haven podcast, episode 358, another edition of the best, the bravest. Interviews with the FDNY's elite, volume 69. If you haven't checked out the previous episode of volume 68, with Don Mormino, who wore two hats, as I covered in New York City Public Safety. He began his career originally as a New York City police officer from 1981 until 1987. And he was about to get his detective shield when he lateraled on over to the FDNY. Did 7 years in the line, working in Brooklyn primarily, 175 truck and 332 engine. And in 1994, went over to the Marshals, where he finished out his career in 2003. Fun chat with him. It'll be a fun chat tonight with our guest, who I worked to get. And I'm happy to say that I finally landed tonight. So looking forward to documenting his career. Hello to all of you tuning in. If you're just watching via Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube, look forward to a great show. As always, the super chat's there. If you got any questions, you know the drill by now. Fire away. At the appropriate time, we will highlight them. So we'll get into a conversation with our next guest after this word, of course, as always, from the Ryan Investigative Group. The Mike the New Haven podcast is proudly sponsored and supported by the Ryan Investigative Group. If you need an elite PI, look no further than the elite Ryan Investigative Group, which is run by retired NYPD detective Bill Ryan, a 20-year veteran of the department who served the majority of his career in the Detective Bureau, most notably in the Arson and Explosion Squad. So if you need a PI to handle anything from fraud, legal services, and anything else that you might require, contact Bill at 347-417-1610. Again, 347-417-1610. Reach him at his website or the email that you see here. Again, if you need a PI, look no further than Bill Ryan and the Ryan Investigative Group, a proud supporter and sponsor of the Mike to New Haven podcast. And just a quick wink and nod to all of you who were on the Getting Salty cruise this past Saturday. That was a fun time. You couldn't have asked for better weather. So thanks to all who showed up to support the show and for your continued support over the years of what we've been able to accomplish. We're very proud of what we're doing at Salty Dog Apparel and, of course, everything we're doing with the program as well. All right, my next guest is a 38-year veteran of the FDNY whose career took him from originally Engine 23 in Midtown, heck of a place to start, all the way to the top of the department as chief of department, heck of a place to finish. Along the way, he commanded some of the city's busiest companies, boroughs, and divisions, earning a reputation as a calm, capable, and highly respected leader. Steady hand guided the department through fires, storms, and the COVID-19 pandemic. And his legacy is one of both tactical expertise as well as institutional strength. For this volume 69 of the best and bravest interviews with the FDNY's elite, we welcome retired FDNY Chief of Department, John Sudnik. Chief, welcome. How are you?
I'm doing well, Mike. How about yourself?
Doing well. I love the summer. I'm sad it's winding down, so I'm just trying to soak up the dog days, if you will. Before we get that classic New England fall again in winter. But all is well over here, and looking forward to chronicling you tonight. So before we get into anything regarding your career, tell me first, where did you grow up, and did you have any family on the job at all?
Yeah, so first generation on the fire department, so I'm proud to say that.
Nice.
But I grew up in Flushing, Queens, so in an area that's known as Queensboro Hill, or for short, the Hill. So I was one of the Hill boys, if you will. So I was born and raised there. I was born and raised in the same house my mom grew up in. So that home was in my family since 1933, and so it was a middle class neighborhood, primarily. Italian and Irish, and my house was a block up from St. Anne's Church and 2 blocks from Booth Memorial Hospital, for those of you who are familiar with the area. So that was my humble upbringing. Spent a lot of time fooling around and playing around in the schoolyard there by St. Anne's School. And it was a great place to grow up.
Oh, for sure. It sounds like it. So it's interesting with guys and gals who came on the job eventually, rather it be PD or FD, because I hear a lot, and I don't know if this was your case, you can fill me in, where, you get to about 15, 16, 17 years old, either dad or mom or any kind of friend or relative of the family goes, hey, start taking the city test. You don't have to take the job, but take the test. You never know, you can get a nice pension. Was that your case?
Well, yeah, sort of. It wasn't. It wasn't my mom and dad. They encouraged me to go the route of school, college. But the guys who I hung around with, guys who I played softball with, guys who I hung around the schoolyard with, everybody started taking those tests. They took NYPD, FD, sanitation. They started taking them around, 17, 18 years old, or filling out the applications for them. I had a good friend of mine who I worked in Tony's Corner Deli with. He got on a job and went to a company in Harlem, and he was a close friend of mine. He absolutely loved it. I also had another good friend of mine who I played roller hockey with. His dad was lieutenant of 138 truck in Corona, and they used to come by the schoolyard and watch us play games with the tower ladder. And when we played games down at Corona, that was our home field. And he was a big push and influence for me to come on the job. I think he was the one who actually got me the application. They had a gym in their garage, and he lived on the other side of Flushing, but I used to go down there and start working out. That's when I started getting some strength, started jumping rope, running, and I was getting ready for that physical exam. And that's the only one that I signed up for, was FD. And obviously glad I did. So
yeah, I'd say that was a wise decision looking back.
Yep.
Absolutely, as we'll chronicle tonight in depth. This is volume 69 of the Best, the Bravest interviews with the FDNY's elite. Our guest tonight, retired FDNY Chief of Department John Sudnik. Just a quick hello in the chat to John Costello, Christian Williams, Steve Iarato, Garrett Lindgren, who retired out of Rescue 3, Bronx in 2002, and Chris Edmund, who worked here from EMS, slightly FDNY merger in 1996. So the academy back then, because I know it fluctuated, when you went down to the Rock 84, 85, how long was it?
For me, it was 7 weeks. 7 weeks in 1985. I was the third class of 85. The last week was like peace officer training. So it was really a 6-week academy and then another week for specialized training. It was, I was working out of college. I got out of college I'd say June. I started working in July. I was in a company down on Wall Street. Hated it, couldn't stand it, and didn't like sitting behind a desk. So the fire department sent me my letter, and I typed out my letter of resignation for that company, and I was in the October class. It was great.
That's such a quick turnaround. I can't imagine an academy being that short today, but times were different back then. But this is an interesting time, not just your career, but your life, because you get the 6 weeks, essentially, like you said, only the last one was just peace officer training. And right from there, 23 engine in Midtown. So, from that period, or actually, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it really was a quick turnaround. So I would say right around Thanksgiving, I was in the firehouse, and where the 23 engine is. It's right around the corner from Carnegie Hall. It's a great place to be around the holidays. A lot of tourists around, a lot of activity. It was really kind of, if you come to think about it, it was really a quick turnaround coming from where I came from. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, in a month's time. And, we'll get into 23 engine, as you said, Midtown Manhattan. Anywhere you go, most probies out of the academy are going somewhere busy. It doesn't matter which of the 5 boroughs. You're going to most likely find yourself in a house that's fast-paced. It doesn't get any faster than Midtown Manhattan. It doesn't matter what era you're working in. Midtown's always moving, because it's not just the boxes. There's plenty of those. It's the MBAs. It's the subway emergencies. There's a lot that prepares you across the board when it comes to all aspects of firefighting. So getting down there, who was the first officer you had? And what do you recall most from the crew around that time in terms of how they guided you and broke you in?
Yeah, so I'll tell a quick story about my first captain, Captain Larry Sloan, great man. And I'll tell you another little story about him later.
Sure.
When you go into the firehouse, obviously the first thing you want to do is meet your captain. That's an age-old tradition, right? So It doesn't matter whether you're on duty or off duty. You go find out when the captain's working, and you go visit him. So he was an old school captain, very very consistent, straight by the book type of guy. He was beloved in the firehouse because of that, because of his consistency. But he was tough. He was tough on the probies, especially. So first day I walked in the firehouse, I introduced myself. He told me, since we don't have a firehouse cat, you're the lowest form of life in this firehouse. And then from there, he went on to say how great of a place it was and how he was obviously very glad to have me in his firehouse. But he kind of set the tone right off the bat as far as saying, you know, where I kind of landed on the totem pole, if you so to speak.
Right.
So, but great guy. And the firehouse, Mike, you know, it was half the firehouse. It was a very senior house, very well respected in the battalion and by all the companies in the battalion. Half the company had over 20 years on the job, half the company. And we had a full roster. We had 25 guys on the roster. And half of those guys probably had 30 years or more on the job, believe it or not. So, and then we had the other half, which had a mix of guys who had, you know, 15, 12. I was the only probie at the time, but there was another guy who just got off probation. So it was really a good mix of experience in the firehouse. The other officers came from various areas throughout the city. You know, one guy came from Brooklyn, from 103 Truck. He was a fireman. Another guy came from the Bronx, where he was a fireman. And, you know, so the learning opportunity was there right from the start.
And it set the tone for what would come later. You know, in terms of emergencies, I'll ask you to. I know they all kind of blend together, but it doesn't have to be a box. It could be anything from that early stage in your career. What's a call that stood out that really shaped your approach, if you will?
Yeah, I would say I think everybody remembers their first fire, right? So I think in my case, and it wasn't long. It was only a few weeks for me. It was I don't know exactly if it was in December or January, but it was a cold night, and you know, we get a box on the west side, and it wasn't a high-rise fire, believe it or not. It was a tenement fire, which you know were I guess if you had to say what the percentage of fires were, whether it was fireproof or non-fireproof, the fireproof fires in Midtown probably outnumber the ones that you got that were non-fireproof. But anyway, tenement on the west side. We were first to engine. The fire was in the cellar. There was a storefront, so you know they popped the Bilco doors, and I had to back up. Our company had a policy where the probie always backed up the senior man, and that was the case. And I know the guy who I was backing up was a guy who I really admired, was a senior guy. His name was Joe Rashuda, and you know, just kind of followed his lead, flaked out the hose line. Lieutenant was, you know, making sure I got the hose line flaked out, and waited to watch Joe put his mask on. I put my mask on, and we went down and we put out the fire in the basement, you know, but unfortunately, I think it went to a second because it got up above, and there's a lot of fires in old law tenements do. They get up in the pipe recesses, but that was my first taste, and as my first fire.
I mean, and thank you for telling that story. Of course, there's the lessons learned with being a pipe man. There's the lessons learned rather in making your hydrants, and a lot of training went into that. But let's talk on high rise for a second, because that followed your whole career where you started. Obviously, once you became an officer, it was something that you had to think about a lot. Because if you look across the country, a lot of big cities, yeah, a lot of high rises in those cities, yes. But I think not only across America, but across the world, the general consensus opinion in the fire service is the kings of high-rise firefighting is the FDNY, because it's not that they have so much, it's that, especially in a borough like Manhattan, there's a lot of them in one tight space. You go one block, there's a 70-story building. You go another block, there's a 75-story building. So how often would your captain or even your lieutenant on certain days, just if there was nothing going on in one of those rare days where it was slow, take it to a high-rise, get you familiar with standpipe operations?
Yeah, well, that's part of your training. I mean, anytime it seems like when we had a run or out on building inspection, it always kind of turned into somewhat of a drill, especially when you're new, right? So standpipe operations are so important in an area, in every area of the city. But you know, our bosses and us, the senior men, they always took the time to, show you the right way to do things, what to expect if this happens. And that probably happens in every company in Manhattan. Because they're challenging fires. It's and it's just not standpipe operations. It's elevator operations. You have to know what you're doing, making sure you're taking the elevator, to the right floor. Different elevator banks, just kind of getting the layout of, and obviously, you can't know every building, every high-rise building, like the back of your hand, but there's a lot of commonalities in high-rise buildings that, and then there's also the ones that are the outliers, the anomalies that that you want to know, and you get that by going on runs, just driving by buildings, and then hearing the stories, and maybe you didn't go to a fire, but somebody else did, and then you come back to the firehouse and they talk about it, and this is what they did at this particular fire. So, and all these fires in Manhattan, as you know, a lot of them are named after the buildings that they're in, right? The Trump Tower fire, or the Macaulay Culkin fire, or this or that. So they're all kind of Midtown spectaculars, if you will. But you learn a lot, even if you didn't go to them, you kind of heard about them, and that was the good part about working in that area.
How many runs was it common for the engine to go on in a year? Not even a year, maybe even a tour.
Yeah, so back then that was remember, that was pre CFRD, right?
Yeah.
So we were kind of a middle of the road company. We didn't have, pull boxes obviously weren't there. There was some ERS boxes, but that wasn't the type of the area where they would, you would go out on those types of boxes. What we did do was go out on a lot of Class E alarms, which were, they used to call it the electronic ghetto, because that kept you busy. So they probably still call it the electronic ghetto. But yeah, we probably did between, probably about 2,500 runs back then a year. So it was and then, I know today, 23 engines probably doing over 5,000, with CFRD and a lot of those Midtown engine companies are doing the same. So, but that's the department in general. I mean, the department is just responding more. The areas are more densely populated now, and but with activity comes learning, right? So you always looking for a chance to try to get out of the firehouse.
Of course, anytime you can. It's an education. I remember a story that Chief Lieb told a while ago on this program. It's about 3:00 in the morning during the early days of Squad 18 in 1998, 1999. I think he was on overtime in 18. And Jerry Tracy, who finished up as a battalion chief, who's also formerly been on this program, was drilling guys at 3:00 in the morning on how to cut a gate and what would happen if you got a box at this location. So, it may not be 3:00 in the morning, but there's always a chance. You can never stop learning. Every call, every tour presents some form of an education.
Yeah, I remember when I was in 23, Jerry Tracy was a lieutenant in a Ford truck. So I remember when he first got there. And very knowledgeable guy. He was a fire tech instructor, and he certainly had as you know, a nice flair about him. Always had, and I'm sure he still does. But
he does. He certainly does. I wanted to ask you, kind of moving into a 235 engine, which takes you to Brooklyn around 1994 when you get promoted. As I've asked before to different guys, and it's the same question here, certain guys kind of come on with the mentality that, one day, even if they don't vocalize it for obvious reasons, I'd like to be an officer. And gradually they learn from their officer and senior guys, and they start really applying themselves to the books for their opportunity. Other guys, it kind of comes to them as they go. Which camp did you fall in?
Yeah, so I would say, I was influenced by a couple of guys in the firehouse who were taking the 80 86 lieutenants test. So when I first got on, they were already studying in the fly house, some guys. And I remember, Vinny Dunn coming into quarters once, and I was a probie. He came in, I believe it was for annual inspection, and I was working that day. And obviously he comes in and he goes through the whole fly house, and our fly house was always immaculate. And the deputy chief, as a general rule, would ask a question about something about the rig in most cases. So I was the probie. He asked me the question, and then he started talking about the lieutenant's test that was coming up at the time. And he advocated for everybody to keep studying, and he was obviously a deputy, and worked his way up through the ranks. And he basically said it's the opportunities there for everybody. You should take advantage of it. And I think he even singled me out and encouraged me to do so as well.
Oh, well, the connection is going bad on us there. Second chief, we'll put the chief backstage. Volume 69 of the best, the bravest interviews with the FDNY's elite. Sorry for that, ladies and gentlemen. We'll wait until the chief's connection is restored there. He was in the middle of telling a story, of course, about studying for lieutenant because in 1994, and I'll let him tell this when he comes back on, he was promoted to lieutenant and was assigned to 235 engine in Brooklyn. So, that's kind of a 5-year chapter in his career along the way and his rise to chief of department. So we'll wait until the technical difficulties resolve. But in the meantime, let me say hi to those of you tuning in here. And if you got a question, as I've said before, it doesn't matter if you're watching via YouTube, LinkedIn, or Twitter, fire away the question. And we'll be able to highlight it at the appropriate time. A quick reminder coming up on the Mike the New Haven podcast, and I'll make mention of it again at the end, will be Mark Peck, who worked at FDNY EMS. The chief is back on. And Chief, we left off with Chief Dunn encouraging you to take the lieutenant's test.
Yeah, so that's what I did. I think I spent. I played. I don't know if you know this about me, but I played for 2 years on the FDNY hockey team.
I did not know that.
Yeah, so it was a great experience, but I was like a third line player, so I wasn't the cream of the crop, but I loved it. The captain of the team, Mike Rositas, was in my fly house, so. But I played a lot of roll hockey growing up, and I felt like I was playing so much ice hockey back then in those days. And then when I picked up the books to start studying, I kind of made it more recreational than competitive, which was, I guess, a pretty good move.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I started studying probably about 88, 89, did what everybody else was doing, went to fire tech, got in a study group. And that was the start of it. And the words of advice that a guy in my fly house said, Tom Van Doren, he wrote the highest in our battalion. He said, when you study, you want to study to be like you want to be number one, because you don't want to have to do it again. They only give the test once every 4 years. So you don't want to go back and take it again 4 years from now. So that was the advice that I took. I was always a pretty good student in school, so studying. It doesn't really come easy to anybody, I don't think. But I kind of forced myself to do well, and I did pretty well.
Yeah, I would say when you're determined, the mindset on it, of course, there's nothing the mind cannot accomplish, and you accomplished it, you made it. And it takes you to Brooklyn because, as we know by now, when you get promoted in the New York City Fire Department, you don't stay in your company. It'd have to be really extreme circumstances for you to do so. You're going to go somewhere else, probably another borough altogether. And you went to Brooklyn. So you jumped from, being either a pipe or a hydrant guy, maybe even a driver. I don't know if you were driving by the end of it, to being in the front seat as a lieutenant. So going out to 235, again, Brooklyn engines tend to be very, very busy in their own right. A lot more fire duty out in Brooklyn, given the size of the borough. Same is true as we covered before of the Bronx. Tell me about first getting there. And before we even get into going out on calls and boxes, just learning your crew.
Yeah, so I didn't go right to 235 engine.
Did you UFO?
Yeah, well, you cover first. So when I got there, the 11th Division, even though I was assigned to the 5-7 Battalion, they put me UFO actually in 204 engine, which has been disbanded. So, and it was a nice place. I actually, went to a few good fires there. And then from there, I went to 202 engine UFO. So I worked around the 3-2 battalion. That's where the openings were, right? But I was determined to work my way back towards Bed-Stuy. I wanted to work there. I knew some people who worked there, and I just wanted to be where there was more fire duty. I worked in an active unit in Manhattan, but it wasn't the amount of fire duty that I was looking for, especially being a young new lieutenant. So I actually reached out to a good friend of mine on the hockey team, Joe Downey, and I knew his dad, Ray Downey, from playing hockey. And Ray put a good word for me in with the division to say, like, there was an opening in the 18R group in the Battalion 5-7. So I jumped on that. And the companies in there were 235 engine, 214, 219, and ladder 111. So I had that R group for about a year, and I was working right where I wanted to. I got to know the chief officers there. I got to know the company officers. I used to work mutuals for guys in all those companies. And that's kind of really where I learned, the full job of being a lieutenant was bouncing through those companies. And I never minded covering as a young officer. I was young, I was single. I didn't have the commitments that a lot of, newly promoted officers had. I just wanted to learn the job, and I'm glad I took that R group. And then when, the opportunity came for a UFO spot in 235, the chiefs there knew me, and they made the recommendation. The chiefs in the 5-7, made the recommendation and put me there. Made the recommendation to the division, and I got a UFO spot in 235 engine. And that's how I ended up in that wonderful firehouse.
And for those of you that are not familiar with FDNY vernacular, UFO stands for until further orders. So as you mentioned, yes, when an officer is promoted, barring anything unforeseen, they're usually going to bounce around for a little bit just to get a feel for the front seat, which is what you did. And of course, this is a 5-year chapter in your career. So for those of you not familiar, 235 engines located over on Monroe Street in Brooklyn, New York. So what part of Brooklyn are we talking here? Are we talking Flatbush, Bushwick? Whereabouts in Brooklyn?
It's right in the heart of Bed-Stuy. So,
even better.
So then it's the eye of the Bed-Stuy is their their call signal. So it's right there, Monroe and Nostrand. You run in with some great companies there. The truck companies, you run into, ladder 111, 102 truck, 132 truck. So you're right. We were right. You right where you wanted to be if you wanted to get some fire duty.
Oh, you were going to get plenty of it. So, again, you had 9 years to learn previously before the promotion. And I feel like that's a good part in your career to make that jump. It's just about a decade on the job. So while you don't know everything, you've been around the block, you've seen some things, you've had a good feel, of course, as we talked about earlier, learning from senior guys and learning from your officers early on. What are the incidents that stand out? It could be a fire where you came away saying, all right, you know what? As a newer officer, I think I'm starting to get my legs under me. I think I handled that pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, so as a young officer, a new officer, it's it's probably the biggest jump you're going to make. I remember some of the earlier fires that I had that it wasn't in engine 235. I remember, a good fire that I had in 204 engine that it was a factory fire in the middle of the night, came in as an ERS box. So, we were there, the roll down gates were already open. So we were there by ourselves, and it went to a fourth alarm, but we were by ourselves there for a while, and we stretched a 2.5-inch line, and, we operated in there until our masks ran out. And that was an early fire that, I guess for a young lieutenant, you say to yourself, wow, this is really what it's all about. But, it's what you do, I guess that's what you're trained to do. I had another fire in 202 engine, which was another significant fire, went to a second or third alarm. And, that fire, I learned about the importance of communications with the chief out in front and giving them a good, concise report on the progress that you're making or you're not making. So that was a learning experience as well. And and then again, when I got into that R group, I was able to work in the engine and the truck, and I got to learn a little bit or a lot, I should say, of both types of operations. And that's every tour you work, you get more confident. You learn a little bit more. You learn a little bit more about the company. You learn a little bit more about the area that you're working in, and and then after that, well, the fires you go to, you can't remember one from the next, so.
Absolutely, and there's also crew management as well, because now as I've covered before, it's not just your own safety; it's that of your crew. Knowing where everybody is. Where's my pipe guy? Okay, he's behind, or he's in front of me rather. Where's my hydrant guy? Is he in yet? Where's my chauffeur? Okay, is he still pumping? Is he coming in? Depending on the scenario. So all of that factors into it too. It's a lot to juggle, but I think with the proper training, as we'll talk about, and as we've covered already to an extent, it's never easy per se, but it becomes less strenuous to manage with time and experience.
Yeah, I mean, our company, all the companies that I worked in, and I would say that, as far as engine company operations go in the FDNY, everybody knows their basic positions, and you have a job to do. You're automatically assuming that everybody is getting it done. We've had to, as far as engine company operations go, there's always the benefit of having a second due engine helping with the stretch, and that makes things go go as well as they could go. There's an old adage that says that probably more lives are saved by proper positioning of hand lines than anything else you could do in the fire department, and that's why having a well-trained unit, having chief officers who know the importance of getting that first line into operation, working. And it doesn't matter which area of the city you're working in. You're going to get that same level of competence, that same level of training. Are you going to run into problems? Yes, you're going to run into problems. But that's the importance of having a boss, having a lieutenant or a captain or a company officer, is to identify what those problems are, and let the chief know, who's out in the street, what it is that you're not doing. If you're how well you're doing making progress when you're getting in there. If it looks like you're going to get it done or you're not going to get it done for whatever reason. If you need more line, you have to, you call for it. That's just, that's the nature of the beast. That's bread and butter engine company operations.
Steve, I see your question in the chat. I'll get to it momentarily. But in light of that, and of course, the first two area of 23 compared to the first two area of 235 is dramatically different. Midtown Manhattan versus Bed-Stuy is night and day. But compared to some of the drills that your officer would run with you in 23, when you first became a lieutenant, what were some of the drills that you took with you, if applicable, from 23 and started running on 235 once you got there?
Yeah, I mean, it's always knowing the type of buildings that you have, that you're operating in, is key. In engine 235, it's brownstones, row frames. So it was, although you had brownstones in Midtown, they were usually $5 million brownstones. And you didn't have a lot of fires in them, but when we got to 235, it's really textbook brownstone row frame firefighting in that area, and that's what you focus on. Did we have standpipe operations in where I was in 235? Not a lot, but you didn't have, you did go maybe on a multiple alarm or into the projects or wherever it is, whether it's a standpipe operation. But so the areas were kind of completely different. But that said, some of the commonalities is, is pump operations. I wasn't a chauffeur. I got promoted before I went to chauffeur school. Like I said, in 23 engine, very senior firehouse. So I think
it wasn't going to happen.
No, I think if you have 15 years on the job, the captain sent you to chauffeur school, unless you really wanted to go, which most of us younger guys, we don't want to. We don't want to take the seat. We wanted, and that's different than it is today. You go to some companies now, and you have 3-4 years on the job, and guess what? You're up. You're going to chauffeur school, which is great because that's something that you have to have, that basic knowledge of pumping operations. But so I would say there's the commonality between the two companies, is just knowing how to get your hand line in position, how to get the right. Always that multi-unit drill. You're always charging lines, right? That's where you learn, how to operate the pumps. If you're in a truck, that's where you learn, and also that's where, we would have, when I was in 23, we'd have a multi-unit drill with 35 truck, and they would always put us up in the bucket, and we get to operate, as working in a tower ladder, and that was great. That was a great experience. But when I got to the Bed-Stuy area, it was, especially the drills that you have, the impromptu drills that you have after runs or out on BI, which is so important. The focus was a little bit different. You're talking about the type of stretches, well hole stretches that you're going to have, a rope stretch, if you will. So although there's still basic operations, that I would just say the difference was the focus.
Talking with retired FDNY Chief of Department John Sudnik here in the Mike the New Haven podcast, volume 69 of the best, the bravest interviews with the FDNY's elite. So Steve's question, if we can highlight that, producer Vick, is he wanted to know, as a lieutenant, did you ever transmit a second alarm before a battalion chief arrived?
I don't recall I ever did, because, and again, most of my time was spent with the in 235, and we had the 5.7 in quarters with us. So if I would have transmitted a second on arrival, and the chief was right behind me, he might have had a thing to say about that. That said, if you're in an outlying company, right, and you could think about some of the engine companies where it takes a while for a chief to get in, transmitting a second on arrival would probably be a little bit more acceptable. But where I was, companies were located, so close together. So
no need.
And that doesn't mean that the chief didn't transmit a second on his arrival when we got there. We've had, I don't know how many exactly we had, but I'm sure we had advanced fire on arrival. You have 2 floors of fire on arrival. That's a second alarm. And but knowing that the chief is behind me, coming in to the box, I'll give it 1075. He'll transmit the second, no problem.
Right. Yeah, and there you go. And that's pretty seamless. Again, it goes back to knowing your area. Mike Thomas, I see your question. I'm going to get to that a little bit later. I just want to make sure I go in order, but it's a good one, and I do see it. So that brings us into Engine 290 when you get promoted to captain in 1999. And lieutenant to captain's an easier transition. A lot of guys kind of describe it as been there, done that. You didn't have 290 long, only a couple of years there, 1999 to 2001 before the promotion of battalion chief, but nevertheless, another great house. You got 103 truck and quarters with you as well, still in Brooklyn. Tell me about those 2 years there and what you most enjoyed about it.
Yeah, so actually it was a lot less than that, believe it or not. I got promoted to captain. I was only captain for 2 years. I got promoted to captain in 1999. Yeah. I got assigned actually to the 8th Division. So again, one thing about our department is, and I know this, from being in operations for 4.5 years, part of is equalizing manpower throughout the divisions and throughout the battalions. So division, when I got promoted to captain, Division 8 needed captains. Guess where I went? I went to Division 8. So I'll try to make this quick. So a good
take your time.
A good friend of mine Steve Garrity, he lived right around the corner from my dad in Rockville Center. And I always wanted to work my way. I wanted to go to the 15th Division. So I was assigned to the 11th. I liked Brooklyn. I got a taste of it. I felt like, I really wanted to get some more Brooklyn work. I just really liked working in that borough. So he said, he goes, there was an opportunity to do an offline detail down to headquarters and work on a project for an OSHA mandate, 2 in, 2 out, doesn't matter. I said, when do I? And he said it'd be a good opportunity to maybe get that transfer to the 15th Division moved up that you were looking for. I said, sign me up. So, and that's what he did. I worked on that from probably 99 till early 2000. And when we were done, we did a great job, I think, because when we were all said and done, Chief Nigro was the chief of operations, and Chief Gansey was the chief of department. And they asked us, where do you want to go? And I said, I'd like to go to 15th Division. And they said, well, is there a UFO spot you're interested in? And 290 was one of the companies where a UFO spot was open. Jimmy Riches just got promoted to captain, and I said, I knew that it was the busiest company in Brooklyn, and I wanted to be busy, and that's what I requested. Another thing, my dad grew up in East New York. He grew up on Barbie Street between Livonia and Dumont. So I had a little family connection there. I heard the stories he used to tell of the old neighborhood, and so there's a little sentimental reason there as well. But yeah, and I knew some guys who worked there, and they said, the company is great company. I mean, if there's any problem with them, you just got to pull the reins back. That's they're just so aggressive, so much into it. And I said that's for me. And so I took the UFO spot, and then I got, I eventually ended up getting a spot. But I was only there for about a year before 9/11. So
yeah, and we'll get into that momentarily. Obviously it was circumstances beyond everyone's control, as we'll highlight. But if you could go back in time, that's a spot. Even though, listen, you worked in plenty of other great places after this, I imagine you wish you had more time there, because it is a great spot.
Oh, of course. I mean, that's one of the regrets that not just being from there, just one of the regrets that I've had is not being able to have more time as a captain, as a company commander, and more time in that firehouse, because it was such a great experience. Used to, great group of firefighters there. Just totally to talk about training, talk about drills at 3 a.m. That was more the rule than the exception. And you didn't, as a captain or even as a company officer, you didn't even have to actually be the one calling the drills. They did the firefighters, the firemen did it themselves. So great senior guys there, that would just come in and just, and I learned a lot. I learned a lot from those guys. Even though as a captain, I learned a lot about that area. Learned a lot about engine company operations, and having the truck there next to you was a bonus. Great fire officers there. I saw, you had Rich Dumig on one of your shows.
He's in the chat.
I watched his segment, and I was getting flashbacks. He hasn't changed a bit. He tells a story the same way he did. And I believe Richie was if I remember correctly, was my 24 partner. So I used to see him all the time. Either I was relieving him and he was relieving me. But what a pleasure working with him, and he and the other lieutenants as well. Mike Carbone, Mike Donovan, those guys were perfect bosses in that firehouse, where their reputation was it wasn't easy to be a boss in that firehouse for most people, or for some people, but those guys fit in perfectly in that company. Sure, Rich Domig was, and I actually got to see see him personally in June. They had a little reunion that they have a couple times a year. So I got to talk to him there, and it was a pleasure catching up with him. So.
No, he's a gentleman. I had the chance to also feature him in my book as well, in addition to featuring him on the podcast. So shout out to you, Rich. It's good to see you pop up in the chat, my friend. Of course, he retired, I believe, out of there in 2002. And Mike Thomas, as you bring up, yes, Lou Refrano, when he got promoted to lieutenant out of 288, was in 290-103 for 7 years before he went back to 288 as an officer. So I'll ask you, there was a series of promotions made because of the devastation of 9/11, the loss amongst the ranks. On the Sunday following the tragedy occurred on a Tuesday. Were you among the battlefield promotions?
I was. It was.
Okay.
I believe the ceremony was on the 16th of September and effective the 17th.
Yep.
But yeah, I was. I was at near the top of the battalion chief's list. I was number 15. I wasn't expecting any movement in that list for at least another year. But obviously we lost, 23 chief officers on 9/11. And we had to, the department had to start rebuilding immediately. So there was that huge promotion right after 9/11. I was included in that.
Yep. And you went to the 50th Battalion subsequently. Out of that, and again, you had that until 2003. So with the 50th Battalion, what part of the city are we talking? What area? Tell me about the layout.
Yeah, so that's huge response area, Battalion 50, Jamaica, Queens, South Queens. So 10 companies in the battalion. So we went from South Jamaica to east of Fresh Meadows, to the west to Ridgewood, perhaps, or to the Van Wyck Expressway. It was just a huge response area, and a great area to work as well. Learned an awful lot working in that battalion.
I can imagine. You also had 127 truck and 298 engine in quarters with you. That helps too, having companies like that at your disposal to utilize. So given the response area, everyone is thinking about terrorism in late 2001, 2002, and 2003. As battalion chief, you can kind of, unfortunately, because of the sensitivity of the times, plan around that in addition to the regular emergencies that you're pre-planning for. So if you can't talk about too much of it, that's fine. But just back then, tell me about trying to incorporate something like that into drills going forward, which I imagine had to be hard.
Yeah, I mean, so, after 9/11, obviously there's this heightened alert of what's going to be the next shoe to drop.
Right.
I don't know, a couple months after 9/11, there was a plane crash in the Rockaways.
Yep.
And, everybody, right, and I was working that day, right? And right off the bat, I thought that was terrorist. I thought that was a terrorist attack. It ended up not being. It was just, a malfunction in the plane, and
right.
It crashed off the Rockaways. But that said, there was everybody, whether it was thinking there was going to be, a chemical attack in the subway, or a car bomb, or something in the airport, something at one of the stadiums. We were the department as a whole was preparing. We were training. We were, a lot of it was specialized training. We were our resources were training to do different things to address the vulnerabilities we had to another potential terrorist attack. And so yeah, I mean, whether you were a chief officer, a company officer, or a firefighter, there was always that situational awareness that you needed to kind of maintain after 9/11. That was like built into the psyche of us all in the department. So,
and it's really a quick turnaround overall. Even before 9/11, 1999 to 2003, from captain to battalion chief to deputy chief. Deputy chief is an interesting rank for you here as we continue to chronicle your career, because it allowed you to at least get some, it essentially get some stability under your feet. You were there for 5 years. You go back to Manhattan to Division III, which Vinny Dunn had Division III forever. So it's full circle for you. The first 9 years, of course, as we covered earlier, were spent in 23. So getting back to Manhattan in 2003 as a deputy, tell me about your goals and tell me about just how you wanted to best utilize the companies you had at your disposal.
Yeah. So, when my promotion to September of 2003, Sal Casano, when I put in my request, I hadn't worked in the Bronx, and I requested from Sal if I can go to the Bronx. He said, I'll think about it, and he put me in the first division, actually. So I was originally assigned to Division One as a deputy chief. I guess Sal really shaped my career personally. Got to know Sal a lot. After 9/11, I got to know him a little bit as a lieutenant, but that's how far back I go with Sal. But he really kind of orchestrated my career to a large extent. And Sal was in the first division. He was a deputy in the first, and he was in the 15th, but he was also in the first. And he was an advocate for working in Manhattan if you're going to continue, going through the ranks. And I guess that's what he saw me. And so I was in the first division for about a year, and then there was some movement up in the third division. A couple guys got promoted, went to staff. And then I asked him if it was okay if I put a transfer paper into Division III. He said, no problem. I did that. I covered there for a little bit, and then I ended up getting a spot in the third division. I was pretty quickly made division commander there, and I was working in what they call, I guess, affectionately known as the flagship division, for probably because it produces so many chiefs that go through that division that go to staff. I could tick off probably a dozen names of people who went through Division III that eventually became staff chiefs. But the area, whether you were in the first division in Manhattan or the third division in Manhattan, they're kind of similar. Different buildings in the first division that you don't really have. Predominantly in the third, you have more loft. There's an area where you have loft buildings in the first division that you don't necessarily have in the third division. Both divisions obviously have high-rise office buildings. Tenements, bigger tenements in the third division. The third division's response area went from 34th Street north to 125th Street. And the first division was 34th Street south to Battery Park, right? So two great divisions. The thing about the third division was the east side. I always said, a lot of attention was in the third division, I guess, for officers. I get to get a lot of officers wanted to get to, company officers wanted to get to the companies in the 11th and 12th Battalion because it caught part of Harlem, right? Which was great. Great companies up there. They definitely did their share of fires. But in my experience, when I was in the third division, the 10th Battalion went to as many fires as the 11th and the 12th, and good fires. A lot of it was. Most of it was, fireproof multiple dwellings, but good, tough fires, and I think it's a lot of that was because it was so densely populated in the 10th Battalion there. And then you get down into the 8th Battalion, 9th Battalion, you got, Times Square, obviously, but you also have, the transit hubs, Grand Central Station, Penn Station, which was really a first division type of box, but third division companies would respond there as well. You have the challenges of the piers on the west side. You have Madison Square Garden. So you just think about all the challenges that. And every one of these places had their own kind of SOP that you're not going to study or read about in any of the books that you studied, because they're so specific to the division. So whether you're in the first division or the third division, you'd have to go and get the book and read, what is it, what's the policy, what are the tactics for, for say Penn Station, Grand Central. Everyone had a different protocol. And then you're dealing with, different aid. You're dealing with Port Authority. You're dealing with, Metro North. And you're getting to know who the players are in those type of agencies. So that's kind of really what makes Manhattan a different animal from a chief's perspective, right, than any other of the divisions that I worked in. And I did cover for a while as a deputy chief, and I enjoyed it. I enjoyed doing a vacation in the Bronx or in Queens or at Staten Island. I worked in every one of the divisions, which was a great learning experience. But when it came to it, the leadership of the job, and Sal asked me to do something, and I never said no to Sal Casano, and he never steered me wrong, and I'm glad he didn't. I had a great career in the third division. I thought I was going to be there for my entire career. I said I'll be here for 40 years. So and I said that when I first got there. I might have still been sitting there now giving you this interview if I was still there. But
because I was going to say, it's you have everything there. And no wonder so many chiefs go through. It's such a great place to learn. Not that other parts of the city don't give you the same challenges and the same ability to really put your thinking cap on as a fire officer. But given the amount of landmarks, given the amount of high rises, we talked earlier about the subways, there's everything there for a chief or any kind of officer for that matter. But we'll just keep it specific to chief to learn, study, as you said, with those SOPs, learn how to deploy personnel. You lit up as you talked about it. So I would imagine, I don't even have to ask you, worked in a lot of great places. That has to be, if I'm correct, the sweet spot of your career looking back.
Well, I spent a lot of time there. So I started out there. I ended up back there as a deputy and a division commander, and then eventually I worked my way back as a borough commander as well for a couple of years. But yeah, it was really just it's a special place to work, challenging. If you're really into a challenge and making decisions and really embracing that something different could happen on any given tour that you come in and that you've never seen before. That's the place for you.
Yeah. Familiarity sometimes, in any aspect of the fire service or any aspect of emergency response can breed complacency. There's no room for complacency in the FDNY. There's no room for complacency in Division 3. That is for sure. And again, I really enjoyed hearing you break that down. This question is relevant in the chat, and we'll highlight it just from that time period. Actually, the other one, producer Victor, from Mike Thomas, the bottom one. The day of the tragic Deutsche Bank fire in 2007. Were you working that day, Chief?
I was not. Actually, on that day, I was actually working. I was on the incident management team, and I was deployed to Idaho, to a wildfire in Idaho. So I was an operations section chief there. I was still in training, relatively new, when that fire happened. But then, actually I was out there with Bob Sweeney, who I believe at the time was the Queens Borough commander. And they both flew us home early to get back to, because that fire happened. So I was not there myself at the Deutsche Bank fire.
Thank you very much, Mike, for the question. And we definitely don't forget the two members who were killed that day in the line of duty. They remain remembered for certain. So it blends together a little bit, different boroughs, but your time as a borough commander, 2008 to 2012, with Queens, and then back to Manhattan again from 2012 in 2014, first as a deputy assistant chief, then as an assistant chief. So, as you're humming along in this, 2011 and 2012 in particular is interesting. We get Irene. Irene kind of nicked us in the tri-state. It was a tough storm, but it wasn't as bad as people thought it would be. We were not so lucky with Sandy. So around that time, I'm not sure which borough you were in when Sandy hit, but just tell me about the prep work for that and then trying to manage it as it made landfall.
Yeah, so I was actually the Manhattan Borough Commander for Sandy, 2012. So I guess I must have been there for a few months when I believe that was October, right? Was,
October, November, around there.
Yep. Yeah, I believe it was right around Halloween. And we knew the storm was coming, right? So, you have the forecast that it's coming up the coast, and it looks like it's going to make a significant hit in the New York City, the tri-state area. So, the plan was already put out. We already have operations puts out an IAP, which is an incident action plan. They let you know what resources you have for that for that potential event, and you put all those resources in place. They put all the borough commands on duty through continuously, through the day, through the night. So we knew that we were going to be there. Usually on an overnight tour, on a normal day like today, you'll have one citywide staff chief on duty that responds to the multiple alarms going on in the city. For this particular event, all the staff were available, whether they were in headquarters or the borough commanders were in their respective boroughs. So, during the day, we were just, I was going to check out the areas around Battery Park and, get to see where the potential storm surge could be. So we were riding around and just, waiting for the shoe to fall, if you would, waiting for the storm to come in. And it came in, probably mid-afternoon, and the first major incident on that day was in Manhattan, and it was the crane on 57th Street, and we had, the boom was just basically flopping in the wind, and right then I think that the winds were not quite hurricane strength, probably tropical storm strength winds, but still precarious. And next thing you know, we're evacuating buildings on 57th Street because we have this I don't know how many ton piece of the crane. Cranes, by the way, are supposed to they're supposed to windmill, or they're supposed to actually freely turn in the winds, but for some reason that function didn't work, and that's why that boom snapped. So, but regardless, it was the major concern on that was that the area on 57th Street beneath the hanging boom had high pressure gas, right? So we had all our agents. We had Con Ed there, Con Ed steam, and we had Con Ed gas. So high pressure steam, high pressure gas. If the boom fell from the 75th story, I believe it was, and down and hit the street, it would have ruptured the steam pipes, which would have in turn ruptured the gas lines, and we would have had a major explosion. So, so our challenge was, okay, life is always a priority. Evacuate. That we had transmitted multiple alarms to evacuate the buildings first on, in the immediate area of the crane on 57th Street, and then we moved on, and I believe it was between 6th and 7th Avenue. So it's a large block with a lot of buildings. So you do the best you can with the companies that you had. And then I guess, after it was sized up by the engineers that came from the building department, they said that there's a possibility that if this thing keeps swaying around, it could collapse, they gave us an area of, and whatever, just say 200 to 300 feet laterally. So now we had to evacuate the buildings on 58th Street and 56th Street. So that took time. It took many hours. It took a long time for the utilities, and we don't shut down major utilities like that. Like a gas main or a steam main is beyond the purview of the FDNY. You have to wait for the experts, because you can cause more damage than you would by potentially hell if you don't know what you're doing, shutting that down. So, but it was a pretty complicated operation for those utility companies to get those utilities shut down, and it took, the larger part of through the day, through the evening. I think I got back to the borough after midnight, and by that time, the rest of the city was kind of, in chaos. Breezy Point was burning down. We had, storm surges in Staten Island, low-lying areas there that were, we had loss of life down there. So just one of those, what do they call them? Once in a century storms.
It was.
So that's what we had to deal with. But we had the resources to deal with it. We did the best we could, and we saved a lot of lives. We saved that day. We did. There were lives lost for sure, but probably by a lot of people who should have adhered to the the orders to evacuate that chose to stay. So.
And I think the blueprint across the board, especially for major cities, changed after Katrina in 2005. And it's unfortunate, but New Orleans, because of the devastation down there and all the critiques of how the emergency response was handled in that particular storm, set the stage for cities like New York and other major cities across the country, maybe even the world for that matter, to prep. Okay, here's what went wrong down there. We can anticipate that here. Let's avoid it. And therefore, as you said, we did have loss of life. We had loss of life, I believe, here in Connecticut as well. But overall, it could have been so much worse, but wasn't, because of the effective collaboration that took place at that time.
Yeah, I think so. We sent units down to Katrina in the aftermath, not before, but went after, to do, obviously the topography of New Orleans is a little bit different than New York City, although New York City is not much above sea level, but a lot of New Orleans was below sea level, especially a lot of the areas that were most vulnerable with loss, with people who were of lower socioeconomic means, and the whole story behind that. Again, that was a function of not implementing their hurricane plans and having a civilian population that were left vulnerable for various reasons. Obviously, we're not going to rehash what went wrong in Katrina. But as far as the FDNY is concerned, we learned a lot by sending some teams down there for search and rescue to about what kind of devastation water could do, storm surge, and it just got reinforced for us in Sandy. And I would venture to say the next hurricane that hits the New York City area, we're gonna, we'll have that institutional knowledge about what could happen, what areas of the city are the most vulnerable, how are we going to prepare, how are we going to respond, how are we going to recover. And there's the good thing about what we do in the FDNY is we document everything. So, if it happens 20 years from now and nobody's still on a job that worked in 2012, guess what? That's okay, because we already have those plans in place. So.
Exactly. And even like I said earlier, even though it was a lesser storm in retrospect, Irene kind of refreshed the model. Okay, what did we do the previous year for Irene? What could we kind of implement from our response to Irene here? Maybe even factors of that response played into the response to Sandy. That brings us into year 29 of your career, which at the time was your ascension to Chief of Operations. And this is an interesting point, too, before we get to Chief of Department, where you have a view of the whole city. By this point, with the exception of the Bronx, really, and you covered there, I'm sure, as a chief, a little bit, but not a permanent assignment. You've had a full view of the city: Queens, Manhattan, and of course Brooklyn. Chief of Operations, which you had for 5 years. Take me through your day to day, because it doesn't always have to involve the major incidents you'll respond to. Just in terms of planning, just in terms of communicating with the officers and just staff in general under you. What was that? What was that time of your career like?
Yeah, so 2014, Dan Nigros, fire commissioner, he asked me if I wanted to be, Jimmy Esposito was the chief of operations. He was going to be retiring. He asked me if I wanted to lead operations, and I was honored to be asked. And it was really, well, let me just say, chief of operations was the most challenging and rewarding, I guess, rank that I had in the FDNY. I did it for 4.5 years. And I think that everything that I learned as a borough commander and watching and learning from the previous chiefs of operations from, I remember when Sal Casano, even though I was not a staff chief at the time, Sal Casano was the chief of operations for, I think, over 6 years before he became chief of department. And I just always remember, so it felt like Sal was the chief of operations forever. And he was there for a long time. But then after Sal, you had Pat McNally. And Pat McNally was the chief of operations when I came to staff. And then when Pat McNally retired, Bob Sweeney became the chief of operations. And I learned a lot from Bob before. And then he retired. And then Jimmy Esposito, who I followed in Manhattan Borough Command, went from Manhattan Borough Command to chief of operations. So I got to see 4 or 5 chiefs operate at that level, and I was on a regular basis as a division commander, as a borough commander, watching these very experienced chiefs do what they do. So I felt going into that I felt like I was really prepared for this position because I had all that experience in the borough, and I was also, I was also a staff chief for a good 6 years, almost 7 years at the time. So I was comfortable being in staff. But chief of operations is such that you run all the fire operations. It's all everything you learn from the firefighter through all your ranks, and all the ranks of chief officer, and you try to bring that all to the table. And also, I felt like, for me anyway, the team that I had in operations, I had Jimmy Daly as assistant chief of operations, Tony DeVita, Dan Donahue, Bob Strong. I mean, these guys they weren't just my colleagues; they were my friends, and we ran it, and it was like our own firehouse there. But we were solving all the problems of the job. And I used to go in and I used to say, you know what, the issue that we're going to deal with tomorrow is happening right now today. And that's the type of job it was. So you had to deal with things as they came on a day-to-day basis. But it also gave us an opportunity to do some things and change some things, that, whether it's, some procedurally or tactically, that we always felt, could make the job safer, more efficient. So I'll give you an example. We were always struggling as a department to try to get the department to comply with the incident command system and sectoring and terminology and things like that. So one of our goals as new in that bureau, me and my team, was to come up with a new bulletin that addressed that finally. And we came up with a bulletin for command and control, and that was based off of a bulletin that we all studied when we were coming up through, for chief officer through the ranks called Division Circular 36. And it was just a division circular, but there was so much in it that made sense about the responsibilities of chief officers and how they were responsible for this, primarily for the safety of the firefighters that are, under their purview, whether if they're in charge of a sector, or a group or whatever it was. We wanted to try to formalize that. And we did. We had, Tommy Richardson got promoted to deputy chief, and he worked on that bulletin for us, as a brand new deputy chief, and did great work with it, including going out and speaking to a lot of chiefs out in the field. And that helped shape that bulletin. But I guess what I'm saying is, with that, at the end of the day, I think what we did was we did a service for the department, and hopefully that continues going forward, where we made more defined the chief's job as being more aware, more in tune with the units that come under their command. And so I think that was one of the things that we did in operations. Another thing that we did in operations was we went from our building inspection program. We developed a BISP program, or we changed it to be more risk-based, because we found that our companies now were doing a company like 290 engine. Okay, right now, I think last year they did 7,500 runs, right? So that is, that's 21 runs on a 24. So sometimes they're doing 10, sometimes they're doing 30. Okay, now, building inspection still has to get done. It's important. And why is it important? Because it's important for the safety of those firefighters and the civilians, but primarily for the firefighters. They have to get into these buildings. And so how we found that the companies that were getting crushed with runs, and a lot of the Midtown companies were, how are we going to be able to get them to if their building inspection period is 2 times a week, once in the morning and once in the afternoon, and they're getting crushed with runs during those 2 days, which they most likely are, they can go weeks without actually doing a significant amount of building inspection. And we needed to try to address that. So what we did was we tried to base it and let them try to get a certain amount of buildings done on the time that they're able to do it, anytime during the week. So if you're going to go out at 10 o'clock in the morning, go for the meal, go into this building, and there was a little negotiating with the unions. They were a little concerned about that, but they understood and they worked with us. And we went from a pilot program for, risk-based inspections. We got a chief that was from the 13th Division, Gene D. Toronto, who was the architect of our BISP program. And we brought him in, and he kind of worked with the logistics of it, if you will. And we had a new BISP program. So as the chief of operations, we were able, and myself and the chiefs that I mentioned were able to implement these parts of or institutionalize or make changes to existing procedures that we had and make it better.
And I would say you did too. And that's something that, you'd hate to find out that a building is in violation or there's a major safety hazard when fire is rolling over your head. It's better to find that out when you're doing the building inspection. And I know it could be a pain sometimes for certain companies, and I get it. But at the same time, to your point, safety, safety, safety. You minimize the risk to firefighters, you minimize the risk to civilians. And if there's potential nefarious behavior on the part of these landlords or whoever's in charge of the building, hey, you can alert that to the proper authorities, mainly the NYPD, and boom, you may have saved somebody's life, if not your own.
Right. Well, all you have to do, and this, is you look back at some of the fatal fires that we had, and many times they were the result of, something, an apartment was chopped up or something was not right with a particular building, that if we could have addressed it beforehand, maybe the outcome would have been different.
Yep, 110%. Before I get the chief of department, there was a couple incidents that really tested the foundation of FDNY operations during this time, just because, and the FDNY responded well, but just because of the complexity and how scary it was. I mean, we had the explosion in the East Village in 2015, where a gas tank, I believe, ruptured and a couple people were killed in that. There was the attempted bombing of the subway of Manhattan in 2017, where thankfully that individual was one of the three stooges of terrorism, was terrible at his job. But then we had the bike attack, too, that same year along the West Side Highway. So as far as the FDNY response to that, take me through trying to manage those incidents when it's chaos at these scenes and so much is happening all at once.
Yeah, so I mean, you can go on and on. You could talk about the airplane in the Hudson, with Sully Sullenberger. I mean, that's just another example. And there's other. We've had ferry incidents, and these are multi-casualty incidents that are very challenging because of the areas that they occur in, the amount of people that are impacted by it. Many of them are, whether they're, many civilians that need to be treated and transported, right? Regardless of the nature of the injury. Some of them are serious, some of them aren't. Patient tracking becomes an issue. When you have, just say, with the plane in the Hudson, we had people that were, we knew we had a passenger manifest. We knew how many people were on board, right? And we had to account for all those people, but some of them were taken to New Jersey and taken to hospitals there, and some of them came to the New York City side. So it takes time. It takes time to hash all that out and figure out if, did every one of those people actually make it, or are we going to be looking in the Hudson River for days for victims? So all that has to be coordinated. Fortunately for us, I think we're pretty. We've gotten good at it, even though each one of those incidents that you mentioned and the one that I gave an example of are different. Yep. I think that in essence, when you get the response of that we come with, that other departments probably don't have the luxury of. We come with a lot of experience coming from whether it comes from the fire side of the equation, the EMS side of the equation. We get together at the command post. Sometimes it's with help of our partners in NYPD or Port Authority or other agencies that come together, and we're working together to try to solve this problem. A lot of times it's obviously you have the politicians that get involved. The mayor wants to know what's going on and wants accurate information, and sometimes that information is not as expedient or forthcoming as what that person wants, and you really have to let the stakeholders know, in this case the mayor, know that this is what we have so far, this is what we're looking to find out, and it may take some time to get there. And I think that's the challenging part of some of the incidents that that you were talking about and that I just mentioned is getting that information back, because everything, whether you talk, and especially in Manhattan, it's if it's not being reported live, it's going to be on the 12 o'clock news at noon, or the 5 o'clock news, or the 6 o'clock news, or 11 o'clock news. They want to know what's going on. And that's a challenge sometimes, but you have to know how to message it properly.
Oh, look at the other day. A perfect example, unfortunately, is the rampage that occurred in Midtown at the office building last week. That was a situation where a lot of personnel, emergency personnel, are converging on the scene at once, in addition to now the media is getting there, and they're staging, and they're setting up, trying to, as you said, get whatever kind of information they can. It's a lot to manage. So I'm sure, you were having flashbacks to different incidents of your own watching that unfold last week.
Yeah, I mean, I guess sometimes it's, every time you hear it, you just, you shake your head. But
right.
this is, it's not the first, certainly not going to be the last. New York City is, as you know, is a unique place, and what happens in New York doesn't make local news; it makes national news. It makes news across the world. So I think that that's understandable because it is New York. But that's something as you go, and that's something I learned as a borough commander, a staff chief, the chief of operations, and I'm sure my predecessors learned the same. The commissioners know, Commissioner Casano, Commissioner Nigro, those guys, Commissioner Tucker now, they know that comes with the territory, and it's New York. So those are the challenges, and that's why we do what we do.
You make lieutenant in 1994. A quarter century later, you make chief of department. That's another great full circle moment for you, where it's not just one thing to be a chief. That's an accomplishment in and of itself, going from captain to battalion chief. Now you're truly overseeing everything as the highest ranking uniformed member of the service. You have a lot of work to do. There's more challenges ahead. We'll get to managing COVID in 2020 momentarily, but just to kind of take a second, when you got word that you were going to be the next chief of department, just take me through thinking about that journey from being a probie in 1985, Chief Dunn visiting quarters and encouraging you to take the lieutenant's exam, as a young firefighter back then, to that moment. What was that like emotionally for you?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I was blessed. It's an honor of a lifetime. And I can't, there's not enough time on your program for me to tell you how much it meant to me to get to that point. For me, my family, just everything that happened in my career to reach the pinnacle of the greatest fire department in the world, and following the footsteps of some people like Pete Gansey. I mean, it was just surreal. But that said, I embraced it. I had decided that when I became the chief of department that I understood a lot about what the job entailed. I was a staff chief for 12 years before I became chief of department, or 13, or maybe 11 years before I became chief of department, and so I knew what the rank entailed, and there's different ways that you could hold that rank and how you conduct yourself. I looked at people and I saw how Eddie Kilduff was, ran the department, and I always admired him. I always admired the way he conducted himself among the staff, the way he conducted himself in public, the way he was the face of the department. I mean, that always was an impression. He left a great impression upon me, as the same thing that it was with Sal Casano or even Pete Hayden. I mean, these guys all showed leadership in a lot of the same ways, but and sometimes in some different ways too. When I got to be the chief, I had a great team. First, let me talk. My chief operations was Tom Richardson, and
can't go wrong there.
I was the chief operations for 4.5 years, so I know that operations runs the department, right? They run the department. And Tom and I got promoted on the same day. Him to operations, I got promoted to chief of department, and we were very close. We worked like I was downstairs with him every day, at one point or another. And, he was always behind his desk typing away and doing something like the chief of operations does, the busiest guy in the fire department. And I knew exactly what he was going through, but, I think we did a lot of really good business together. And, and his team, his entire team, his team in operations, top notch people, and going from Richie Blattis and Jack Hodgins, who obviously became chief of department. And I remember when Jack came onto staff, and I recruited him, and I'm glad that he thought about it for a few days, but he said yes, and I'm glad he did. And I was glad to see. It was one of my proudest moments. I was already on my way out of the job, but when Jack became chief of department, I was there for his promotion, and it was a special day for him. It was a special day for me. So the team was there. Had a great chief of fire prevention, great chief of training, Tony DeVita, when I was chief of department. I mean, these are just top notch. Joe Jordan is chief of fire prevention. Lillian Bonsignor is the chief of EMS. These are highly qualified people. So what did I have to do as far as just make sure that if there's anything that they need, I met with my bureau heads on a regular basis, whether it was once or twice a month, and they ran their bureaus, and I ran the department. If there's anything they needed, I helped out. And there was a lot of ceremonial events that go along with being the chief of department, which are very, very rewarding. That's part of the tradition of the department. So, both the happy and the sad, and then the responses. It's just, I was a big advocate for myself. I'm required to go on a fifth alarm, and if I knew when a fourth alarm came in, I was on the phone with Tom, and he'd say, I'm already going in. And I said, okay, let me know. And he'd give me, a heads up that, what was going on with the fire. And, if he knew it was going to go to a fifth, he'd call me up and said, listen, John, it's going to go to a fifth. I think you should start heading out, 10-4, and then I'd go. And, Tom Richardson had, 40 years on the job. He's going to put out any fire that I could put out. It didn't mean I didn't want to go to the fires. I mean, I enjoyed from the first fire that I explained to you, right, that I went to as a young pro being 23 engine, that feeling that you get when you go to your first fire, it never leaves you, till the time you leave the job. You have the same feeling whether you're standing out front of a building at a fifth alarm as the chief of department. When you leave and you get in the car and go home, all right, there's a feeling that comes over you. If I could bottle up that feeling and sell it, I'd be rich, So that is, that was, to me, it was really the pinnacle of, and obviously, for obvious reasons, it was an honor of a lifetime to be the chief of department.
Chief, I'm going to go back, hopefully in a couple of years when I've gotten on the line somewhere. I'm going to come back to this interview. I'm going to come back to that moment where you just explained it. And when I go to my first box someday, I'm going to remember what we talked about. Because a lot of guys have said the same thing. And I'm not just saying this because you're sitting in front of me. I don't think anybody's ever summarized it as well as you just did. And it meant a lot as it is, but it means a lot, especially now as I'm trying to begin my own career. So thank you for summarizing that, because you're right. Every guy I talk to, and now it's not to say you're happy to see somebody's house burn down. We're not saying that, but just being able to go there, put the fire out, have a hand in making the situation better. There's not a soul I've talked to involved in the fire service that doesn't feel the same way.
Yeah, it's that's what we do, and that didn't start in my generation. That goes back to it's
always been there.
It goes back in our department to 1865.
Yep. And just briefly touching on it too, having a team like that around you was so helpful, obviously, in the next year, 2020, because that was an invisible bullet. At least with previous incidents, there's a site where the incident occurred. You have an idea of what's there, what's not there, and how to manage it. This was different, and it was prolonged. It went on for quite a while. So especially as chief of EMS was overrun at that time with different calls they had to respond to. So having, being in the trenches with individuals like that, I mean, obviously we wish the pandemic didn't happen, but again, made easier by having such qualified people around you to help lead you, or you help lead them rather. And of course, offer input to each other on how to manage a crisis that we have never seen before in this century?
Yeah, so I remember, it was, I remember exactly the conversation that I had with Commissioner Nigro. It was early in the morning. He said, he was just on the phone with people he knew. He used to take his trips to Italy quite frequently when he was retired the first time. And he had a lot of friends in Italy, and he said he spoke to people there, and he said there's this virus that's a pandemic that's going through, and it's pretty bad, and it's going to eventually work its way over to us. It's already a given, and that's the first I heard of it was from him. And when he was saying it, I just couldn't contemplate what are we talking about here? When it came to just say viruses, or we were trained in or prepared to respond to some like bioterrorism attacks, like an anthrax, white powder type of incident. But I think nowhere in the conversation that we were having at the time was a global pandemic, but that's what we were headed for. And and then from then on, and then when it hit us, right, I guess it was right before St. Patrick's Day.
Yeah,
when
it's March.
When it hit, and then the rest is history. We know what happened, but yeah, that was it was challenging. I mean, a lot of it was from the way we were thinking, and again, talking with the chief of EMS, the chief of operations, with the fire commissioner, and a lot of the senior chiefs, and it was all geared around what is going to be our capability to continue to respond and staff our department if this global pandemic impacts our staffing levels. That was, I think, the overarching concern from the get-go. Like, what happens if 50% of our department is sick and can't respond? What are we going to do? Because we can't go and say, okay, we'll just call up Jersey City, or call up some department, Yonkers, and ask for their help in responding, because they're going to be having the same issues, right?
Right.
So that was the overarching concern. That, and how do we limit our exposure so we can maintain the staffing levels that we need, right? So we had to start thinking, okay, PPE was huge, right? So the recommendation at the time was masks, actually was respirators, N95s. How many do we have? How many do we need? How many could we get? That was an issue. What is our response going? I mean, if our responses are going through, and even the way we responded, eventually, we would get a little bit of a heads up where the call would come in as fever, cough, or something like that. So this way we knew that if it came in as a fever, there's a good chance that this is a COVID patient, right? So we knew PPE, had to put that in, take that in consideration. Unfortunately, early on, the first couple of weeks when the pandemic was at its peak, a lot of the victims, the patients that we responded to, had already passed. So you would do, if the patient was viable and it was within the ability to work on the patient, and then transport, that's what we did. But there was a percentage of patients that were not viable, that for obvious mortal injury, obviously from the disease.
Yeah.
And so in that case, you want to limit your exposure. So you don't want to impact or infect, some response. So there was a lot of challenges, a lot of one day to the next, learning from the day before, planning for the next day. Our medical leave rates were always, we were watching, whether we have to have a contingency of changing the chart, perhaps, going to an A-B chart if it was necessary, or ABC, depending on our level of medical leave. And that was the beauty of having, the experience that we had in Bureau of Operations and the Bureau of EMS Operations. Having that experience, you bring to the table when you have something that nobody's ever experienced. But guess what? We learned on 9/11 that when we went to an A-B chart, after 9/11, we knew how to implement it. So there's institutional knowledge that you have that you could apply from, in this case, to the pandemic. But certainly, it was long. It was, we were, I remember having conversations. We couldn't wait to get the vaccine, right? We wanted the vaccine. We wanted to get it out. The vaccine was going to be our savior. And then when we got the vaccine, there were the issues of, well, what if some people don't want to take the vaccine, unfortunately for Tom, I was on my way out. He was acting the chief of department when he had to deal with some of those issues. And unfortunately, it got a little bit political, it got a little bit ugly, but ultimately, I think that, our department, again, during that period of time, as we always do, we rose to the top.
Yep.
Fire and EMS, I think, as far as the darkest days for EMS, I would say that was among their proudest days, the Bureau of EMS, since our merger. I'd say that if you talk to the senior EMS chiefs now, and even the ones that are retired, and you probably had some of them on your show, they would talk about what their challenges were, and I guarantee they said that was their proudest moment in their history, or among the most proud moment in their history, was during the pandemic, as tragic as it was.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me of that line from A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. Would you ever want to go through something like that again? No. But at the same time, you saw the best rise to the occasion, as you said, and lead the charge forward to, of course, keep people as safe as they possibly could, mitigate the medical emergencies, and a lot was learned from that. That said, I'll get to your retirement now. It took a lot out of everybody. And much like you saw in 2002 after 9/11, a lot of guys and gals put in their papers. Same thing, 2020 into 2021, 2022. When you left in 2023, was it primarily because of that and how much it took out of you, or were you thinking about it anyway, even without the pandemic?
No, honestly, the pandemic had nothing to do with my retirement. It was, I wouldn't even say it was planned. It was a confluence of reasons, personal reasons. Yeah. There was, I think that, ultimately my goal was to get to 40 years with the department. That was always my goal. I thought, like, I turned 63 years old today. So, and I always thought that I would still be on the job at 63 years old, because right. I came on when I was 23. So if my plan went accordingly, I'd still be working. And I know people do. One of my best friends, who is I grew up with, and he's the senior man in Ladder 108. I'm going to give him a shout out. Gerard Brickman. He's him and his brother were, his brother Steve, who passed away, who worked in 58 Engine, was two of the toughest guys that I ever met, hands down. All right. So, and I grew up with these guys. He's 64 and a half, but I spoke with him today, and he's in the battalion now, but I spoke to him last year. He was climbing off an aerial ladder of 108 and going into a fire on the top floor. And he was, so, it's different for, obviously, in my position, I was I was the chief of department. So, but you know, there were a lot of reasons, Mike, that and I would say that primarily was family. I mean, I think over the years, I sacrificed some family time for the benefit of the department, which, and don't get me wrong, I never missed anything. That said, there were some things that I think, I didn't want to miss going forward with my family. And, in particular, I had a young daughter. She just graduated college. She was just getting into college around the time. She's doing great. She's a very bright kid, takes after her mom. And so I wanted to spend more time seeing her continue to develop. And, that was primary. There was some other, but I think that as far as if I made the right decision to leave too soon, I mean, if you count on how many sleepless nights I've had, second guessing myself whether I left too soon, maybe I did, but I did what I did. Maybe I thought that there would have been a role for me in the future, outside of the chief of department at one time. Things have a way of working one way or another, but especially since, I felt like I had so much experience and so much time and so much dedication to the department. It's hard to leave. But we're living with it. I'm getting the hang of retirement. It doesn't suck, as they say. It's pretty good. So.
And you deserve it. I mean, you worked hard for those. You worked your butt off for those 38 years, and there's a lot to be proud of, a lot of memories you made, and a lot of bonds that'll last you a lifetime. Guys, you worked 23 with every step of your career towards the end. You made bonds that'll last a lifetime, which has been a common theme in our conversation tonight. So, even with those sleepless nights, I'm sure there's a lot of days where you find yourself sitting in that same chair you're sitting in right now, probably smiling, thinking back to something on the job that was awesome that you got to experience.
Yeah, I mean, it's all I have to do is, read the department orders or talk to some of my old buddies, go to a reunion or go to an outing, play around the golf with some of the guys, and you're right back in it. That's the best part about it. And without the, listen, those jobs. As when you get higher up, and just like I'm sure it's the same way in NYPD, probably more so, probably on steroids when you get to those levels. The stress, the stress and the politics have a way of weighing on you. So.
Yep. Well, that brings us into the rapid fire. 5 hit and run questions from me, as we always end with, and 5 hit and run answers from you. You could say pass if you want. And the first one is, and we talked about it, so I kind of think I know what your answer is going to be, but I want to ask anyway. Time machines were real, and you can go back in time to any part of your career. You talked about how much you love being a deputy in Manhattan. You talked about how much you enjoyed 23 and obviously 235. Where are you going back to tomorrow if time machines existed?
Oh, gosh. Yeah, I'm tempted to pass on that one because, but I would, okay, so.
You can pass if you want.
No way. So 23 engine around the holidays, I've been sitting around the kitchen table, just, I would go back to that 235, going to the fires. Some of the guys who, and in both those firehouses, those guys were, they were, close friends. They were in my wedding, came to my wedding when I got married. So my wife is friends with them, friends with their wives. I would go back in a second. 290, I wish I can go back to spend more time there. I just my regret was I didn't spend enough time there. but, still see those guys, love those guys. Shout out to Joe Bizell. He runs a great reunion twice a year for the guys on Sheffield Avenue. I love it there. So any one of those places in Manhattan or Brooklyn, I wish I can go back.
Yeah, listen, not a bad place to go back to. I know you mentioned Chief Dutton earlier. Besides him, who's another chief you would say, or even it could be a captain or lieutenant at any point in your career that you really looked up to early on?
Yeah, so early on in my career, there's a couple, and and I don't want to leave anybody out, but when I was in 23, I got the opportunity to drive one day Joe Grasso, and he was the chief in the 9th Battalion. He was the captain of the Ford truck. His nickname was the High Rise Drifter, and he had this real humble, quiet way about him that I really appreciated. And I remember the tour I drove him in the battalion, like it was yesterday. And we actually ended up going to a good fire right next to the firehouse too, right next to 54 and 4, second along. Another one, Dennis Cross in Battalion 5-7. And, all the chiefs in the 5-7 are great. And one of the best parts about 235 is you got to learn from every one of those chiefs. But, Dennis was just very similar to Joe Grasso. I think they might have worked together in Brooklyn at one point in time on Dean Street, perhaps. But just when you look at a chief and you say, this is who, you kind of, want to emulate, and having that personality, Dennis was one. And, this obviously, he was killed on 9/11 along with, and, it just as fate would have it, he was with Timmy Stackpole, and I saw them both when they came up to the command post, and, couldn't figure out why they were together, but, it's another story for another time. And then, a little bit later in my career, Mike, I looked, when I was down in headquarters, obviously, and even before headquarters, I kind of get to know Chief Gansey a little bit, when I was in 235. He was a chief in the 5-7. Obviously, he was gone when I was there, but I did know him. He used to come back to the functions, Chief Gansey was great like that. He'd come back to somebody's, birthday party, and he knew who I was, and, we chatted a little bit, so I got to know him. And then when I did my detail down at headquarters as captain, I got to know him a little bit more. Dan Nigro, I got to know him when I was on that detail as well. And, other chiefs down there at headquarters, Joe Callan, I always remember Joe as teaching fire tech, and he was really enjoyed going to his classes. And, these are, senior chiefs that, staff chiefs at the time, and I was a young captain who, I think I took a liking to. Obviously, they had stars on the collar, but I think they saw something in me. And then last but not least, Sal Casano. Sal, and I mentioned this before, one of the true, I truly, I would say, legendary people in this department, for many reasons. And a lot of it has to do with 9/11 and his dedication, his commitment, and his service after 9/11 as chief of operations, chief of department, fire commissioner. But that said, I never met anybody, and this is all ranks, who knew everybody. And if he met you once, he knew who you were and always remembered. I remember, I was a lieutenant in 235, and he was in the 15th Division, and we were by the command post at a 15th Division box, at a multiple alarm. And I go up to the command post, report it to him, and he'd say, "Yeah, John, do me a favor, take a line into whatever exposure." And I was like, wow. I said, I don't even think I haven't met him. If I met him, I met him once, but he knew my name. And that wasn't just me. He knew everybody. and that's a quality that to me, and it's I wish I was more like him in that sense. That just amazing, and obviously what he's done after leaving this department, what he continues to do to advocate. I watched a podcast, and he's involved with the 9/11 Memorial Museum, Tunnel Towers. He's a board member. He's a board member for the FDNY Foundation. These are the names that I just mentioned. These are great people, just great
Absolutely.
people, dedicated.
And they molded you. And they definitely molded you. Before I continue with the rapid fire, I don't know if you crossed paths with him at all. He was on the show last week. He was an assistant chief of EMS. Jerry Gombo sends his regards. He says, "Thank you for your service. Enjoy your retirement."
Oh, yeah. I remember Jerry. Yeah. Thank you, Jerry. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, good man, Jerry. Again, if you want to, for those of you who missed his episode, go check it out. We had a lot of fun conversating last week. Third question, the rapid fire: most uplifting call you ever had in your career?
Okay. So, it wasn't really, it wasn't a call. It was actually, for me, the most uplifting day was the day Timmy Stackpole came back full duty. I was working that day in 290 when he came back and worked his first tour when he came back from full duty after his injuries at the Atlantic Avenue fire. And it was a big thing because the commissioner was there, Commissioner Von Essen came, and it was a big media thing. But, I got to know Timmy pretty well. We got promoted to lieutenant together, and we became friends ever since. And when I got the opportunity to work with him, when I got to Sheffield Avenue, talking on hours, and his nickname was, Jobs, right? So, and he said, you know why they call me Jobs? And it's like, because I like to go to jobs, and I work a ton of part-time jobs because he had a big family. So he was always working a side job. But, the guys loved him because he was Timmy. I mean, he could, he's a legend. But that tour, I'll never forget that tour when he came back. And, in many ways, Timmy wouldn't have had it any other way. So obviously, if he didn't come back, he would still be here. But, but
if there's ever a definition of a warrior, Tim Stackpole is it. That's a story that, even though we unfortunately lost him at the Trade Center on 9/11, just the courage shown to get back from that, when that would have ended anybody else's career, speaks to the level of heart and guts that Tim Stackpole had. So much so we're still talking about it almost 30 years later, and we'll never stop.
He wasn't going to take no for an answer. He was coming back. I remember he was doing light duty down at the medical office doing fit tests on masks. And I remember going down there one day. He's like, "I'm coming back." And if everybody knew the extent of his injuries, he came back, and it's just a testament to the epitome of what it's of a lot of things, but courage, bravery, dedication, you name it. That's Timmy Stackpole.
Yep. Tim Stackpole, we remember you, my friend. Fourth question of the rapid fire: one value every new officer should live by.
Yeah. So, and I know that it's probably a recurring theme, but mine is mine when I was chief operations chief of department, I go around saying is that on every time you put on the uniform, you have an opportunity to show leadership. So whether it's, in the kitchen, how to drill, on building inspection, how to fire, off duty, whatever it is, people are looking up to you, as a new officer. You're no longer one of the guys. Our department is no different than the military, or they like to be led. The men like to be led. It's your job to lead. Every time you put on a uniform, you have an opportunity to show leadership. So make sure they don't forget that.
Awesome. And of course, fifth and finally, of the rapid fire, what you miss most about the job. You talked about it earlier, but you can expand here.
Yeah. So I would say, in one word, camaraderie. I think that when I got on the job, and I told you a little bit about it in the beginning, I was not happy in the world of cubicles and high finance down on Wall Street. When I got to the fire department, I realized how important friendships are, and the type of work that we do just build upon, that sense of camaraderie, of trust, of support, and that's evident through our department. You could see it, and from our happiest days to our darkest days, all those things, get you through it. I remember there was a guy who I went to high school with, and we actually went to the same college, and he was very successful and worked in Wall Street, made a lot of money, and retired actually before I did. And he, they honored me at our high school at a 5K run when I was chief of department. And I got talking to him, and he just couldn't have enough great things to say about the FDNY. And my high school, we had Timmy Stackpole went to my high school, St. Francis Prep, in Fresh Meadows. So there were a handful of alumni of St. Francis that got killed on 9/11 in the fire department and otherwise, NYPD, some civilian. But he was so impressed about. It's almost like I felt like if he had to do it over again, he would have chosen a different path. So coming from a civilian who was very successful, that said a lot to me. But I've seen other people make that transition. I watched a little bit of getting salty with about Pete Gansey, and I heard Chris Gansey talk about it, and he was in a similar situation, very accomplished, Ivy League grad, MBA, probably would have been making substantially sums of money, a lot more than he's making now. But he obviously was, and he said the best gift that that he ever had was coming on the fire department. So so that's the long answer to saying it's all about the people.
Yep, it's the greatest job. I wrote a column recently. It's the greatest job, I said in that column, that a mortal man can have, and I stand by that sentiment. It is truly the greatest job in the world. There's nothing like it.
I will not disagree with you in that sense, Mike.
Well, Chief, I really appreciate your time. This was a heck of a show. Before I say goodbye to the audience and stick around, we'll talk off the air. The floor is yours. I always like to give my guests the opportunity to do shout outs at the end. So if you got family or friends that you want to shout out, go right ahead.
Yeah, no, I think what I'd like to do is just acknowledge all those that made the supreme sacrifice. They're the true heroes, right? So, and their families. I just want to acknowledge those. It's not a shout out. It's just an acknowledgement. That's, they are the bravest of the brave. And, that's something that I'll never forget. And I know that our department will never forget.
Well said, Chief. Well said. Thanks as always. Like I said, we'll talk off air, so stick around. Thanks to all of you who tuned in, whether you watched on YouTube, LinkedIn, or Facebook, and those of you that will watch this later or listen to it later, Apple, Spotify, Spreaker, wherever it is that you may get your podcast. Coming up next in the Mike the New Haven podcast, of course, as I mentioned before, he was New York City's most senior paramedic at one point. He came on in 1975 and stayed through the merger with the FDNY in 1996, retired in 2005, has been teaching forever. Mark Peck for volume 70 of the Best, the Bravest interviews with the FDNY's elite. So that'll be a good show. And after that, next Monday, worked in the NYPD, came on around 2004, had a variety of different commands before ultimately retiring as a lieutenant and transitioning into podcasting himself. and that'll be retired NYPD Lieutenant John McCary next Monday at 6 p.m. So thanks again for all you tuning in. For those of you listening on the audio side, for tonight's outro song from his 1985 album, The Dream of the Blue Turtles, it's Sting with If You Love Somebody, Set Them Free. In the meantime, on behalf of retired FDNY Chief of Department John Sudnik and producer Victor, I'm Mike Colón, and we will see you next time. Take care, everyone. Have a great night.